Okay, great. Well, again, good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Kate Forer. I'm the Executive Director for Vermont Woodlands Association. We're really excited to be hosting the webinar this evening on apple tree pruning. And what a timely topic. And I know it's a topic that is on many of our minds here as spring kind of comes across our landscape here in central Vermont. For those of you who are not familiar with Vermont Woodlands Association, I just wanted to spend a minute just introducing you to who we are. We are a statewide nonprofit organization that works to educate and advocate for the stewardship, use, and enjoyment of our forests here in Vermont. We host a lot of educational programs throughout the year to help landowners, land managers, professionals, and all decision makers really to educate and advocate for the stewardship, use, and enjoyment, as I mentioned, of our forests here in Vermont. Our work really focuses on building a culture of forest stewardship. And I like to say that we do that through not only connecting folks to each other as woodland managers and stewards, but also through hosting events just like this, activities throughout the year for folks to be able to learn and also, get some hands-on opportunities to gain skills in things like pruning apple trees. So, like I said, we're really excited to host the webinar this evening. Our presenter for the webinar is Dave Wilcox. Dave wears a lot of different hats. And so I think, Dave, you're here this evening, presenting about apple tree pruning, probably wearing a number of those different hats. Dave is the watershed forester with the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. He oversees the acceptable management practices for water quality on logging jobs through his work at the department, and he also oversees a variety of other water quality initiatives. But in addition to his hat with the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, Dave is also, he serves as a board of director for Vermont Woodlands Association, and he is also a Vermont tree farmer. But before all that, I also had the opportunity to work with Dave when he was a district forester with the Urban and Community Forestry Program, the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, and UVM Extension. And through that work, Dave provided a whole bunch of different pruning workshops and presentations to communities throughout the state. So I'm really, again, excited to have him join us this evening. Dave and his family own property in Berlin, where I know he has spent many, many, many years pruning apple trees, releasing apple trees, and probably restoring many apple trees on his property in Berlin. So with that, Dave, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Kate. So I put in the chat that I'm going to be sharing some videos from within my PowerPoint, and it may be a little choppy going back and forth. I can't, for some reason, project my voice and my video sound at the same time, so I have to readjust every time. But thanks everybody for attending the PowerPoint the webinar. I want to talk about tree pruning and maintenance. I'm going to share to get started here. Um, so everybody wants to know about apple trees. Apple trees are hugely important to many animals and people as well. They're beautiful plants, and they provide a lot of diversity and benefits to Vermont, and they take a lot of maintenance. So that's why we're here. We want to learn about pruning them and keeping them on the landscape, and producing fruit. So what we're going to cover today, a little bit about apple tree physiology. We're going to talk about releasing trees, which is kind of the first step for many wild trees that we find. And we're going to talk about why and when we prune, how to make a proper pruning cut, and then get into the general pruning principles, talk a little bit briefly about pruning tools, and then hopefully get to some questions that folks may have. So the pictures you can see on this slide are some of the trees that I have around my house on our property, and we use them mostly for cider, and a few table apples, not as many as we would like. They don't. They're A lot of them are wild varieties. They're um, kind of small, but they make great cider. And we feed a lot of wildlife. I like to joke around that I prefer my apples with my venison because I'm a deer hunter, and they feed a lot of deer that I like to pursue. So, um, talking about um, putting those trees out in the open aside for a little bit, we're going to talk about apple tree physiology, and apple tree release. And apple trees, the number one thing they need is sunlight. They are not shade tolerant at all. They begin to die back if they don't have shade. The crowns shrink when they get suppressed, and they're not able to survive for very long. And long in tree um, the tree world is years, maybe a decade if a tree can last, if it starts to become overgrown, like the picture in the top left, and then you see the picture in the bottom. Um, that's a tree that's fully released. It has sunlight, um, and you can see in the other photo, what happens when they don't get sunlight. They die back first at the tips of the branches, and then to the main stem. And apple trees are very resilient. They want to live. They want to find a little hole where there's some sunlight, and they shoot out sprouts and try everything they possibly can to to stay viable. And if we don't release them, if they don't um, get some sunlight, a lot of times they fail. And we see a lot of old apple trees that have gone by the wayside because they just couldn't keep up with the shade. And the here's some the picture in the bottom left is a tree that looks like it should have plenty of sunlight, but the fact that it's growing in a maturing forest. It just didn't have anything right around it, but it just didn't have enough um, sunlight because of the height of the trees around it. So that's one thing we can't have to think about when we release trees, is to go wide enough, because they need that angle of the sunlight. Think 45 degrees at the base of the tree, um, looking out without having anything in that view, to block the sun. That's a big area. And then we have to think about, what kind of resources do we have to maintain all these trees. If you go out and try to save every single apple tree on your land, you're probably spreading your resources too thin, and you probably can't save them all. And sometimes you have to cut an apple tree down to release another apple tree. That's really hard for some people to do. And again, it depends whether you have 5 trees on your land or if you have 50 trees. You're going to think about them differently. Um, but those are some of the decisions and choices that you have to make. And use your resources on the trees with the most potential, the trees with the most healthy crown, the trees that don't take a lot as much work to release. And often they are the trees with the best crown, because those trees with the really small crowns are the ones that have been shaded the longest. They probably have more release that needs to be done to get them back. Um, and if you can do it, periodic light pruning is better than one big heavy pruning. And if you can, looking into the future and what getting being the most efficient in maintaining trees, oftentimes it's maintaining them by mowing around them is the easiest. So really opening them up and making it so that you can get near them or close to them with a brush hog is by far the most time, or the easiest way to do it, and the least time consuming. Um, and also, as in any of our activities that we do in our forest, keep in mind other aspects of habitat like cover and diversity. And apple trees um, are hugely important to all species of wildlife. And you can see in the bottom right hand corner that, although it's not an apple tree, it's a service berry, which is another soft mass species that's very intolerant to shade but very important to wildlife. Those are bear claws climbing that tree after the berries in the spring. So having some, and animals don't like to walk right. They don't walk right out in the middle of the open and stand there and look around and um, and they're not at ease when that happens. So they like to have cover. So leave some of those smaller patches around your apple trees, mostly on the north side where you don't have the need the where the sun isn't shining, and be creative about how you lay out the your um, habitat blocks. And here's a tree just to talk about kind of the resilience of apple trees. This is an apple tree that is growing on the edge of a small group of trees, and every year it just keeps leaning over and leaning over and leaning over and trying to get to that sunlight. And you can see, just the bottom branches are starting to die. Some of them have died, and this tree can very easily be um, rejuvenated by, cutting a couple of these pine trees, um, pruning off some of this lower growth that's about to die, and that tree will actually balance itself out eventually. And many apple trees have a early history of this bent stem, and they can be brought back pretty easily with a little bit of release and some light pruning, and then maintenance. Um, talking specifically about release, and somewhere in this picture there's an apple tree. I know it's hard to imagine, but and this is an area where my family's been trying to maintain trees um, for several decades now, and the forest is vigorous, and we get lots of regeneration. So this is just a series of slides, and then I'm going to go into a video of the release of this tree. So this is before anything was done. There's an apple tree about from where I'm standing, and I took the photo maybe say 50 feet dead ahead in this photo. And here's the first pass, knocking down some of the fir and spruce and hemlock and a few pine even, um, and a little bit more. And so we've got some of the younger growth out of the way, but this isn't really what was competing with the tree. It's what would be competing with the tree in 10 years. But right now the tree is higher than a lot of the stuff that we already cut. But what's competing with the tree for the sunlight are the taller trees, the balsam and the spruce. So some of those in the back got cut. We cut more on the front, and eventually we'll have to continue around this tree to as the trees get taller, they need to get cut farther and farther back. Um, but as the video will explain, there's a reason why this side of the tree is much more important. So I'm gonna stop sharing and then share again. Okay, so here we got an apple tree, very different situation. We're out in the woods, on the edge of the woods, anyways. And here you can see the forest around us is growing in pretty rapidly. Luckily, north is that way, so we've got good sun, good south exposure here, and we've released this side of the tree, which is the south is the most important side. The big balsam that we cut here, we're about 40 to 45 years old. This apple tree is probably older than that, goes back to when this was pasture, probably 50 or 60 years ago. And there were loads and loads of apple trees around, but we couldn't keep them all maintained because they all need sunlight, and we've done our best to hold them here, keep the ones that we have. We're in a group of maybe 10 to 12 apple trees here. Great wildlife habitat. We leave some cover around along with the apple trees, and the deer and the bear and the turkeys and the grouse and the squirrels, they all use these trees tremendously. So we didn't do a lot of, because we released this tree, this is about the third time I think in my lifetime that I've released this tree. And all I did was really cut out the deadwood. We pruned a few suckers off the bottom, but not very many. It doesn't have a huge crown compared to the age that a tree is. Think about the tree that we pruned, that was in the yard, how much of a crown that had. So we gave this tree sunlight. We took out the dead wood. Now we're going to let it recover and regain that root to shoot ratio. And when the next time we're back, hopefully the crown has developed. We keep this open around it, and this tree will last here a long, long time. Um, so that's the story of more of a wild-grown apple tree that we're losing lots of these trees because they're hard. You know, Vermont, the forests are growing up, and we can all do our part to maintain some of these trees. Very important for the wildlife and for diversity. Okay, I'm going to share again. Can you see that now?
You're
Okay.
all good.
Okay. Some and that video, you're going to see the video that I referred to in a little bit. So, but that tree is very different, twice the age of the tree that we will look at pruning in my yard, but you know, a fraction of the crown probably. Um, so again, some more, basic tenets of pruning or of release. South side is the most important. The more room you give the tree, the better. You can't give it too much room. Um, and when you have a tree that um, really is, obviously getting a lot of release, um, prune out the deadwood when you do the release. Don't prune the tree at the same time. Don't take any live branches out of the tree during the same year that you release it, because you're likely to shock the tree, and have too much response and not enough root to shoot. That's out of balance, and the tree may not respond anywhere near like you think, and it might actually send it into shock and do it in. So give it a year, maybe two, if it's really weak. And also, like I talked about before, suggest leaving low growing native shrubs for cover. Serviceberry is great because it's also a soft mast. Dogwood, nannyberry, elderberry, all those kind of um, you know shrubs that aren't going to grow up and compete with the for sunlight around the apple tree. You remember, trees in Vermont, we're lucky, as we've just witnessed. We get plenty of water. It's sunlight that the competition is what the trees are struggling for. Um, in many soils in Vermont that were parts of old, hill farms, and most of Vermont was, typically could use some lime, 1.5 to 2 pounds, 2 tons per acre, and that's roughly 8 to 10 pounds of lime per 100 square feet. So, um, you know, a bag of lime really goes for a couple trees, and sprinkle it out around the drip line. Not Doesn't need to be right near the base of the tree. It needs to be out where those roots are, where the feeder roots are, which is farther out. Um, okay, so here's a tree. Just some photos of trees that you know could use release. This one, I'd say moderate in terms of how covered up it is, and how suppressed it is. Definitely get rid of the younger stuff around the bottom of it, and the taller tree behind it. Again, we're standing on the south side of this tree, and there's a trail right there, so it's a good one to put the effort into, because it's kind of easy to get to, and already is mostly open on this south side. And that's part of the reason why it has a good crown, or a decent crown, is because it isn't covered up on every single side. Here's one that's, it's fallen apart. You can see it's got at the base, you see another tree growing, or a dead apple tree, and it's got a lot of tall spruce around it. It's growing in a kind of marginal spot. This would be a lot more work to maintain, to release, and um, as you can see from the shadows, um, south is kind of over our left shoulder. So, and there's some taller spruce there. So this one, would need a lot more work, but it's still, it's got a decent enough crown. And again, if you have 5 trees on your property versus 50, you're going to look at these a little bit differently. So, and here's a tree that I would say is doing pretty well, honestly. Um, but it's getting to the point where it's got some spruce growing underneath it. It's got some looks like red maple really sprouting up next to it. This is one that you could really um, get ahead of and protect it. Keep it growing, get rid of that stuff from around it, and keep it. This one, I think you could prune um, pretty easily. Prune this tree as you released and kind of freed it up a little bit from this brush. Um, and so, and we'll have time near the end for questions. But I want to start talking about pruning, and we know why have to release trees because they can't they don't can't survive in the shade, and why do we prune trees? Obviously, it's kind of the same reason, really, to maintain the health, because as the trees aren't shade tolerant, the branches aren't shade tolerant. We're just talking about pruning is just release within the tree, honestly, directing the growth of that tree towards the branches that we want to maintain and um, perpetuate for growth of fruit and vegetation and just basic overall health of the tree. And we can prune out poor unions so that the tree we can reduce the risk of the failure of the tree. We can improve the tree structure and growth, um, and then obviously reduce shade and wind resistance. And all of that influences flower and fruit production, improves light penetration, which overall improves the fruit development. Apples, large red apples, you need to have a lot of sunlight into the interior part of the tree um, to get that. And when do we prune? The dormant season, December to mid-April, when the trees are not active and they're not growing. There's no leaves, so as soon as the leaves fall off to right before the leaves start to break, um, we're in the the pruning season now. Right, I like to do it right after the cold part of the winter is over, um, and it's a good activity to do when it's too mucky to do anything else. Uh, and that also allows the tree, when you make a pruning cut, you're obviously wounding the tree, and trees don't heal, they seal. So every year a new layer of growth on the tree will start to grow over that wound. And if we do it in the dormant season, we get immediately one growth um, of new tissue growing over that wounded part of the tree. And there's fewer pathogens and insect vectors in the dormant season. There's no bugs flying around now. So if we have any pathogens or disease, the bugs aren't spreading it from there to the wound when the wound is fresh. Hopefully, there's a couple weeks go by at least for those wounds to dry out and be less attractive to those insects. And Yeah, so it's a little bit about when we prune, and then just like anything else, there's the proper way of doing things, and this is a little bit has changed over time. We used to prune a tree like we limb the log, make it flush, and we've learned that the proper pruning cut is not parallel to the stem. It's perpendicular to the branch, and it's circular in cross section. Um, Let me move this thing. And it's outside of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar, and it leaves that tissue intact because that tissue is the what grows fast, and is designed um, to rapidly grow over and seal the wound. Because this happens. Pruning is not. We're mimicking what happens in nature when we do a pruning cut. When trees grow, branches don't grow up in height as the tree grows. Trees get taller, branches stay at whatever elevation they were started at. So when the tree gets taller and the tree's 50 feet tall, the branch that's at that used to be at 5 feet doesn't get any sunlight anymore, and it probably hasn't for years. So what does it do? It dies and it falls off. And when it falls off, it falls right out of that branch bark ridge and branch collar like a socket. Everybody's seen those branches, and that round wound, it will seal over that broken limb, and then eventually 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you won't even notice that there was a limb there. So we're just mimicking that by cutting the branch off, and leaving that wound, or that branch bark ridge and branch collar, to seal over the wound faster. Um, and here's a little bit of more visual on the branch collar and the branch bark ridge. Um, and this is, if this is the slim good body, I call it, picture. Um, Without the skin or the bark, you can see the tissue, and how this is really stem, not branch, and you don't want to cut that off. You want to cut the branch and leave all that. And here's a little demonstration of the kind of decay you get when you do a flush cut versus the kind of decay you get when you do a correct cut that leaves the branch collar and the branch bark ridge. So here are a couple more examples. They don't always, some species, it's very obvious. Some species, it's not as much. Um, but generally you can find it if you look. And sometimes, like this branch, it's farther out than you think. Um, but that's the correct place out there. You don't want to cut it flush to the stem. Um, and and just one thing about um, the proper pruning cut and on a branch that's big and heavy, what happens if you just start cutting at the top of the branch? It's going to tear, right? You're going to get halfway through or three-quarters of the way through, and the weight of that branch is going to pull the bark down, and you're going to get a strip of ripped bark directly below that branch, a foot or two down on until it breaks off. So we don't want that to happen. We want to release the weight of the branch before we make the cut, and we use the 3-cut pruning method. um, and the first cut, where the arrow points, is out the branch a little ways, long enough, call it, make it a handle that you can hang on to when you're making the final cut, but go out 6 or 8 inches, make a little undercut so it doesn't tear there, and then make a top cut just out a little ways. That branch will fall off, and then you have a nice handle to hang on to, and you make the final cut just outside the branch collar and the branch bark ridge. So here's a video. I'm gonna stop sharing. Share again with it turned on.
So this is an example of the proper pruning cut. We've got the branch bark ridge here and the branch collar to here. So we want to be perpendicular to the branch, not necessarily parallel to the stem that the branch is on. So I'm going to make this cut. Hopefully it's not too, doesn't shake too much. And also you can see that I've taken the weight off the branch first. So there's the proper pruning cut.
All right, are we back? Okay. Um, so now that we know how and when to prune, which obviously we all want to know which branches should be removed. That's the whole point of it, right? Um, and there's kind of a checklist that I go through when I prune trees. I always start with the dead, damaged, or diseased branches. And you can identify these by um, from a distance. A lot of times, dead branches are, there's no bark typically. Damaged branches are broken, like a lot of our bear friends like to break our apple trees up. And then diseased branches can be a couple different things. It can be fire blight. It can be an array of things. And we want to first we want to get rid of those branches, so that uh, they're out of the mix. They're not going to be they're not going to last very long. And obviously the diseased branches we want to get rid of. And if you know you're pruning out diseased wood out of a tree, it's a good idea to put that aside somewhere, and actually get rid of it and burn it, or um, drag it a long ways away, so that it can't reinfect the tree where you've made the pruning cuts. I always leave the brush on the ground under the tree until I'm done, so I know how much I've taken out. And then most of the time, the trees I prune are in a field, in a hay field or a lawn, so I have to pick up the brush anyways, and I get rid of it, so it's not reinfecting the tree. And um, the other so after we've gotten the dead, damaged, and diseased branches, we're looking for branches with poor architecture, branches that are rubbing, um, sprouts and suckers, which are vertical shoots that come off typically the top of a branch that's used typically more horizontal, and they grow straight up, and it's a mechanism of the tree to try to vegetatively kind of regrow. And it's kind of a shock sometimes, response from a tree when it gets heavily pruned. And sometimes just there's some individual trees and cultivars that just s- have a lot of sprouts, and you have to keep after them. um, and then the other thing we look for is competing leaders, which are basically, it's just like two trees that you're releasing one from the other. You have two branches going in the same direction that are trying to occupy the same space. You pick the branch that has the best chance of having a better crown, so to speak, and you get rid of the other branch. And then crossing branches that are growing back into the interior part of the tree, or duplicating other branches. And then shaded branches that are typically weak, and they're a lot smaller, but they're interior to the tree. Okay, so I'm gonna start another video. All right, so this tree is on our yard here in Berlin. It's about 25 to 30 years old. It's a volunteer, so it was grown from seed. A long time ago, somebody threw an apple core out here, and this tree grew. We did a lot of work in the yard around it, but it survived. And I've been pruning it for about 15 years. I would say lightly to moderately heavy every year. It has a lot of suckers, so it's a good tree to talk about suckers. Um, Come on in and we'll look at the suckers. So suckers are the same as water sprouts, shoots, and basically you see where they come off the top of the branch. And if you look at the other branches, they're kind of all over the place. I did actually try this or last summer to do a little bit of when it was first growing, to prune it off. And I think it helped. Normally they're 2 feet long, and this year they're only 1 foot long. So that's an option. It doesn't seem to hurt it doing it in the summer, not in the off season. And basically it's real tedious, but you have to clip all of the suckers off. And you can see these are wounds from previous pruning, and there's not much you can do about it. I basically, what you're doing, what this hat does is takes the energy, instead of the energy from the tree going to the sucker, it goes to the parts of the tree that you want to grow, which is here's an older sucker that I didn't get in the last couple years. Actually, I'm going to take that whole branch right off because it's interior to the tree.
So as you can see, there's a lot of little pruning to do. And when I get down closer to the ground where I can reach, I'll use my hand pruners. And I just try to get as close as I can. There's no branch collar or branch bark ridge or anything with this. It's just prune the sucker off. Okay, cut. Okay, so I have a series of photos of that tree. It's kind of a famous tree, I think, in my yard. Um, it was an inch in diameter when we started working on our property. And that's the God's honest truth. That tree was, that's how I know it was not a planted tree, because it was such a tiny little whip next to this old garage. And when we fixed the house up, I decided I almost bulldozed it, and I thought, well, maybe we can keep it, and we did. And it's really kind of a cool lawn ornament. But this is the tree in 2020 in the spring, right after this pruning video was done. This was the spring before. It was in flower. It had so many apples we get stuck underneath it on the lawnmower. Um, Here it is in 2011, and you can see good, beautiful flowers. The tree it's an amazing. I don't know what it's just its own variety, because they don't, who knows what it is. The apples ripen about the end of August and they turn to mush in about 3 days. So it's not a great table apple tree or any. It's really just a good wildlife apple. And here's a picture in 2010, and you can see how I'm really trying. This tree just wanted to go straight up, and I'm pruning it and trying to get it to go out, and it worked, because that tree is as wide as it is tall now. Um, but here's a picture in 2006 of that same tree. And this probably is maybe a year or two into when I started pruning it. Um, and you can see I'm working in, just tiny little pruning up in the top of the tree. But it's it's a it's a great tree, and you can do a lot with structure. It's a beautiful tree. Um, if you just keep after it when they're growing. So some general rules: don't remove more than 25% of the crown in 1 year, and that's not 1 day. That's in 1 year. Um, and if you have to remove more than 50% of a branch, then remove the whole branch. Basically, I'm make fewer bigger cuts is actually less shock to the tree than a bunch of smaller cuts. And always maintain live branches on at least a third of the tree's total height. Don't create a little lollipop with a tall tree with just a tiny little poof of a top. And you have to kind of calibrate your pruning degree with how fast the tree is growing. Faster growing, and more vigorous trees can be pruned um, more than slower growing trees. There's two types of pruning cut. Um, the thinning or removal is where we're taking out a whole branch. Um, it's not, like I said, it's not those little 1,000 little cuts. It's a bigger cut to get rid of a big branch, and then you just kind of leave that area. Or a reducing or heading cut. This is where you're working more in the tips of the branches. I like to think mostly on younger trees. You're reducing and heading and trying to get lateral growth by trimming the tip of a leader. Um, and they're usually smaller cuts. And it's designed really to change the dominance of the branch, the apical dominance, so it stimulates lateral growth. And uh, when we talk about pruning, then this is a difficult part to do in a webinar. But um, if you're gonna cut a branch and leave a lateral, that lateral needs to be at least 1/3 the diameter of the stem at the union. It's called drop crotch pruning. So you're looking at the stem below the fork,
And if the lateral that you're leaving is 1/3 the diameter, you're okay. If it's less than a third of that diameter, the idea is that there's not going to be enough food produced in that stem or in that branch farther out there that's going to keep that stem alive. Food only moves in one direction. It doesn't, you can't come down a branch with food and then go out another branch to feed it. It just goes down towards the roots. So there needs to be enough live uh, leaves out at the end of a branch to keep that whole branch alive. And here's, you know, broken branches. You can see that one split probably by a bear going up there and pulling on it. It happens a lot. It's amazing how much breakage there is, and sometimes it's snow. Um, Apple trees hold a lot of weight. If you have a bunch of apples in a tree and you get a very early snowstorm in October, that's when we've had a lot of apple tree damage in early snows with trees that are laden with a lot of apples as well. Um, and here's a picture of weak inner branches. These are the first going to be the first ones to die when that crown kind of closes up on that tree. And you want to get rid of those um, as soon as you can. Um, and then competing main branches. This is a great example of that. You've got this kind of serpentine stem growing up around the rest of the tree, and we did this in 2 years. We did a pruning first to, it's called subordinate that stem to make it less proportionally as large as the rest of the tree, and then we finally took it off the next year. And eventually that tree was just a single stem tree. Um, so here's another video. I'm gonna set it up.
All right, now we're going to prune a tree that is not a volunteer. So this is a tree that I planted 22 years ago. It's a red delicious, and it has been pruned before, not anywhere near as heavily as the previous tree, but it's not in bad shape. It's a very vigorous tree. This tree was loaded last year, has beautiful apples, and you can see it's a grafted tree, as most nursery trees are, because apple trees don't reproduce true to their form, so they have to be vegetatively propagated. And you can see there's quite a bit of interior branches in this tree that we're going to take out. Not a lot of sprouts like the other tree, so it's going to be a little different. It's going to be more larger branches, and there isn't any deadwood. I don't see any disease in this tree. We're going to I'm going to pause the video and then prune the tree, and then we'll resume and I'll talk about what we took out of the tree, and we'll look at the brush that we took out of it. So
I think I missed a video back here that I'm going to go to right now. So apologize for that, because there were two that we didn't see the after video of this one. So I apologize.
all right, so we've got this tree finished now. It didn't take us very long. We pruned about, you can see the brush pile. It's important to keep the brush, keep track of the brush you take out. You don't want to remove more than 25% of the crown in any one pruning. And you can see, if you get closer, you can see the suckers. The suckers are gone. And then if you look at the edge of the farther out on the branch, you'll see we didn't prune all these off. These are the spur shoots, and those are where the flowers and the apples will be. You can actually see some leaves and remnants of apples. This tree was loaded last year with apples, as were many trees in Vermont. So I know that's you could take more branches out of this tree, but because it's vigorous, uh, and I worked on every branch trying to separate them, and there's always more. It's hard to walk away from a tree, but we've got more trees to prune, so we're going to call this one good. And again, I do this every year to this tree, so it's a little different than pruning a tree every 20 years or every 5 years even. So I know that if I miss something this year, I'll get it next year. If that sucker, if I missed it and it turns into a little bit taller, a little bit longer, I'll still be able to get it. So on to the next tree.
So I apologize that I missed that video, but I realized we didn't see the end of it. And my 12-year-old daughter was the videographer for this set of videos. And she did it awesome. But it's hard to show this stuff in a webinar, but this was I think this works as well as anything. So here's another video of taking out a big stem. This would be one of those larger cuts in a tree to open up the crown in from competing branches.
Okay, so we're working on this tree. I've got one big branch I wanted to show that I'm going to remove, and this is a pretty good sized branch for this tree, but you can see there's multiple branches going the same way. This is a nice big branch, but it's in between two others that I want to keep. So I'm going to cut to take the weight off. I'm going to cut it right here. First, I'm going to make an undercut. And then I'm going to make a top cut. And as that branch goes, it's going to go. Now you can see some space in the tree. Now I'm going to make the pruning cut right about there. Up a little bit. Yeah. When I get to the end, I want to be careful, so I hang on to the branch. I don't want it to tear. And there's our finished cut. And one less sprout. All right, cut. Yeah.
Okay, everybody caught up? We on the right place? Everybody can hear me? Okay. So this is a picture of that tree that just got that I was just working in. And again, it's hard to see the depth of this because it's a pretty good sized tree, and it's big around. You know, it's as big around as it is tall almost. Um, this is an open grown red delicious with very vigorous growth. But basically, what you look at is after the disease and the damage, um, branches are gone. You're looking for those interior branches. We're looking kind of north now, and the video is facing east, so we're getting a little bit different perspective. Um, but I know it doesn't look like a lot was pruned out of this tree, and I have one more. Yeah, there you can see all that brush that came out of this tree. This was kind of the same. I think that branch might have been up here that we took out. But we kind of had to stop because we got to so much a percentage. And I've never, how do you measure it? It's all by eye, the 25% rule. Um, you never really know, but you know when you shock a tree because the next year it's um, really struggling, and they can, perfectly live branches can just turn up dead when you shock a tree. So it's always good to do multiple um, pruning episodes, and it's not, you know every 10 years try to whack the heck out of a tree. And I'll go to the next. And so those are trees that are young and vigorous. And I know there's a lot of people probably thinking about, trees like this, um, that are maybe 100 years old. I know that these the photo, bottom right photo, that's our house. And these trees in the backyard were 100 years old. They were planted in the 20s by the farmer that bought this property. His grandkids told me that their grandfather planted them around the early 1920s, mid 1920s. So they're close to 100 years, if not 100 years old already. And you can see through some of them, literally, through, not through the branches either, through the stem. Um, and I just go very easy on these trees. And the tree that we pruned in the video is right here, and I'll take more out of that tree than this tree kind of has as a crown sometimes, so they're very different. They're individuals. This tree in the top right corner tipped over before we even bought the property, and I've just kind of slowly pruned the branches that were left and into the little trees, and this tree is loaded year after year with apples. It's a little hard to mow hay around, but it produces fruit. And this tree, no, it's this tree. This tree took it hard last year. I wondered how long it would go, and I've got to start thinking about replacing some of these trees because they don't live forever, obviously. But um, my advice on big old trees like this is do what you can from the ground. um, with a pole pruner, and try to keep the dead wood out of them. Try to make a few key pruning cuts in the crown if you can reach. Um, but a lot of them, these bigger old trees that are open, that are fully open, that don't have a lot of shading, don't need too much pruning. Honestly, sometimes it's hard to say whether the pruning is better or not pruning in some of these really really old decadent trees. But don't give up because they are resilient. And it's amazing how, like I said, even when they tip over, they can still they can still survive and produce fruit. Um, and as you saw in the video, a lot of my tools, primarily a handsaw and a pole lopper, and a hand lopper. Uh, once I have some long handle loppers, but mostly it's the handsaw. I try not to climb too much. I'll use a ladder sometimes, but really, if it's up in the air, I'll try the pole saw. And I like pole saws that have just a lopper head, and then you take that lopper head off and you put the saw on it. Because if you're trying to do both at once, it gets really heavy and it's unwieldy to fit up through the crown of the tree. So I also wanted to. I think there's my pruning crew. They're older now, but they know how to prune trees. Um, I want to take time for questions. I know we got maybe 5 minutes or so, but I just wanted to put in a plug for um, our pruning workshop, which got moved from this Saturday to next Saturday. But we've got some great trees to prune in Tunbridge. It's always a good time. It's a hands-on. We do a tree together as a group and then split up, and people really get into it. It's intimidating for folks to um, start making the cuts on their own. And that's a great way to do it and build confidence. So, Kate, I'd like to open it up for questions if
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Well,
haven't
great.
been monitoring.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thanks for such a great presentation. You covered a lot of ground tonight. I know there are a lot of questions in the chat box, and I know as folks head out into the fields and forests to prune apple trees, you'll probably have some more questions once you get out there and get pruning. Some of the questions that have come in, there was one question about liming. Can you talk a little bit more about, do you recommend trees get limed every year? Is it appropriate to lime other fruit trees as well? Just can you share some kind of tips for folks who are interested in learning more about liming trees?
I I think I don't recommend um, fertilizing without a soils test because you don't know. um, you can over fertilize. I liming I feel like that's a safe thing to do. If you limed, I don't know what point you could lime too much, whereas you could pretty easily, I think, fertilize too much. So I tell people don't fertilize without a soil test, but you can go ahead and put lime down at that rate that I talked about. I think you could do that every couple years without worrying about over liming. I wouldn't do it. I don't think you would need to do it every year. um, but if you did it for a period of time and you were wondering, you could do a soils test, and and that would and that might tell you that you don't need to add lime. You need to add something else. So and in some cases, the fertilizer isn't as beneficial unless the pH is adjusted.
Yeah,
So that's where what a soil test would tell you. So I would say, lime it for you know like every couple years for a little bit, and then get a soil test done. But right off,
that's
I
a great.
think you could do it.
Sorry, Dave, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say that is a great tip, and just as a somebody who used to work at UVM Extension, just a plug for if you're interested in doing a soil testing, you can contact your local UVM Extension office in order to get a soil test kit. So that's a great suggestion. There were some questions around suckers, Dave. Can you talk a little bit about the practices around how many of the suckers to remove? Um, you know. Um, See, I'm trying to go back up to those questions.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
any concerns around, I usually recommend not removing all the suckers in one fell swoop, so that you kind of send the message to the tree to reduce its energy towards growing suckers over time. But can you talk a little bit about sort of any tips on removing suckers, and then also what about old suckers? So, the ones that we saw in the video were only 2 or 3 years old, but what about
Right.
somebody who might have like a 10-year-old sucker? How might you recommend they?
That's a great question. Suckers are a tree's response to regrowing a crown, and creating new growth where it's a response. And you can rebuild a tree with suckers. I have many of those. That one tree that has the tree that fell over and has the crown now that's grown up. Those were suckers. That when the tree tipped over, they grew out of the top part of the tree and they started going up, and those were, without those suckers, that tree would be dead. So suckers, in a healthy, vigorous tree, are a nuisance. But in an old, dilapidated tree, you can use a sucker, and space those suckers out so that you have a balanced tree, and you can tip them, and so they have lateral growth, and you can create a whole new crown out of a sucker. The thing to keep in mind, though, and I saw it in some of the notes or some of the chat, is that sucker is not attached to the tree the way a good branch union is. So they're somewhat susceptible to breakage. Um, and really, it's cutting off all the suckers is an energy thing. You get you reduce the flow of energy into those suckers, and you get it into other parts of the tree. Granted, you're still going to get suckers, and those are the trees that do it no matter what. I don't know that you can convince a tree. I've never seen a tree I could convince not to sucker. It seems like I have ones that do it and ones that don't, and the ones that do, they get desuckered. um, and the other thing about, that tree in my yard, when I do climb it, I know that when I climb it, I'm probably um, turning on some of those buds in the stem because I'm wounding it a little bit, and that's why I'd rather not climb it, but sometimes that's easier than trying to put a ladder up and use a hand lopper and everything. But yeah, suckering is a response, and in the right place, a sucker can be helpful. If you see the tree starting to go downhill, or the tree literally tips, sprout that goes straight up can be the future of that tree. So they're not always just cut them off. Um, that's a good question. There's a lot to it. It's hard to get into all of that with you know in this amount of time. But yes, great question.
Great. And Dave, just you mentioned sort of the challenge of getting up into an apple tree. There was a question in the chat about ladders. I'm wondering, I know in the past, we always recommend trying to prune from the ground. But do you have any recommendations on ladders or advice for somebody who is trying to address some pruning needs up higher up in the tree?
Well, way up in the tree, um, it's difficult. The ladders a lot of times um, has to be an extension ladder, and that's really risky, putting a ladder up into a tree that's 25 feet off the ground. But the tree the size of the one in the yard there that I worked on, I actually prefer a good sturdy step ladder that supports itself, if long as you're on, and that's on flat solid ground. Step ladders can get squishy in soils, but you can put a little piece of plywood under the two legs so that they don't sink in. And I like step ladders because you're not relying on the tree to hold you, and you can test it and make sure that it's rugged. But it's a yeah, it's just, whenever you start to not feel comfortable, then stop, basically.
So say, not
And
recommended,
don't
but
do it alone. Not recommended, but
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that suggestion. And again, I think in general, we do recommend that you try to prune with both feet on the ground, right? And because it can be very dangerous if you're trying to use a ladder in a tree. There are a number of pole pruners. They come at different lengths, as I understand it, Dave, and you might know more about that. But and then at some point, sometimes you just have to say, okay, that I'm doing the best I can, right? And you can't get to every branch. So
right,
um,
right. Yeah,
hopefully that helps.
in terms of the different kinds of pole pruners, I prefer the sticks that you can add on to each other instead of the telescoping ones, because the telescoping ones seem to be heavy. Um, and and I so I whoops, I unshared, but I'm still here. Um, Yeah. So I have a 6 foot and an 8 foot pole, and when I need extra length, I snap them together, and when I want something a little shorter and a little quicker, I separate them and use whichever is appropriate.
Great. Okay. Good. Well, thanks for all these tips, Dave. And again, just a reminder to folks, as Dave mentioned at the end of his presentation, there are a number of upcoming hands-on opportunities to get out and practice some of the pruning. So I have them listed here on the screen. I'll drop a note in the chat, a link to our e-newsletter that went out last week with additional information about all of these upcoming opportunities to get out in the field and get your hands dirty, if you will, pruning apple trees. I did want to just mention, Dave mentioned the VWA apple tree pruning workshop that was originally scheduled for Saturday has been pushed back to next Saturday, March 16th. So I'll be sending out. I've already sent out an announcement to those who have registered for that workshop. But if you're not around this Saturday, do please consider joining us next Saturday. Again, I'll put a link in the chat for more information on that workshop. But that is hosted by VWA, and it'll actually be here in Tunbridge. We had to postpone that because of mud season. So again, thanks again for your presentation tonight, Dave. Really appreciate all the videos. I think for me at least anyway, it's such a great way to see what we're talking about here, and to sort of see things in practice. So with that, just want to thank everybody again for joining us tonight. And a quick plug, with for Vermont Woodlands Association. Again, this is really what we do. This is really what we're all about, is creating opportunities to learn from each other, learn with each other, and to get out into the woods and connect with our forests here in Vermont. So for more information, please check us out. You have a link to our website. And also, please feel free to find us on Facebook. We are a member-based organization, and so if you're not currently a member, just a plug, to consider becoming a member, because we do offer a whole bunch of different opportunities for our member community throughout the year. And again, with that, thanks again, everybody, so much for joining us tonight. Really, Dave, appreciate you taking the time to share all this great information.
Happy to do
And
it. I saw lots of questions